Live everywhere.
Daily Co's Radio on netrootsradio.com presents
David Waldman. Kagro in the Morning Show. Now, here's David Waldman.
Hey, good morning, everybody. How you doing? It is Tuesday, December 4th, 2018. Just took me a little while to get the microphone to actually turn on there, but I guess we seem to have it in place now. My goodness. Well, we're ready to roll, sort of. I guess minus the microphone, if that's important to you. On yet another show, Daily Co's Radio is live now. We're reminded by a bell this morning. Whatever's happening today, Kagro X, that's me, is all over it like glue. And even better, I'm like Elmer's glue with sparkles, which is fantastic. And I guess, all the kids are into it these days. That's what the kids are saying. That's what the kids are calling it these days. Elmer's glue with sparkles. All right, well, we're grateful for finding that out. I think I've seen the sparkle thing. I saw, I was at a restaurant this past weekend where the waitress who was helping us that night, we always find that out, that my name is so-and-so and I'll be taking care of you tonight, so, or helping you tonight. Anyway, she had sparkled eyeshadow, and I kept thinking I was afraid I was having a stroke every couple of seconds. I was like, there's light flashing out of this person's eyes. I don't know what's going on here. Either they're an alien and they're taking over this way, or I'm having some sort of incident. I don't know what it is. And then finally I realized, oh no, there's just sparkles in the eyeshadow. So yes, as the mighty OCD tells us this morning, it's time for some Kagro X in the morning, hot and fresh off the airwaves on Netroots Radio. Can you dig it? Well, you have no choice. It's time to dig. Real liberals do it live, baby. So get ready for it. And it's time to go. It's Tuesday, and that means we're gonna. Well, it's looking like a solo flight again today. Of course, tomorrow, being Wednesday, we'll be lucky enough to have Greg Dworkin and Joan McCarter with us. And, well, good. That's fine. We can handle it. There's plenty to talk about. I'm not certain what I want to do first here, although I was thinking that it might be of some interest to continue at some point with the weird blood feud among the Saud family members. I don't know how you would describe the extended Saud royal family. They are a royal family. I don't think we're stretching the truth in calling it that, but I thought it might be interesting to take a continued look at that feud that may have, I guess, motivated the Jamal Khashoggi murder. We had to leave that one off probably not even midway into this very complex story. And I thought it might be worth revisiting. Let's see, we should also update the latest on what's going on in North Carolina's 9th District. I don't think that anything substantive has changed, but lots of attention being garnered. And it seems like, well, the story will be borne out to be pretty much what we were thinking. I think there was some additional reporting done thanks to Judd Legum and his Popular Info newsletter. I think he has dug up some additional material. In fact, I guess got a hold of some of the copies of the absentee ballots themselves and the paperwork that went along with it, which appeared, according to some of the others covering the race from on the ground there, to establish a pattern that I guess would lead you to conclude pretty much what we had concluded already, that there was some serious ballot fraud going on here. Here's his piece, exclusive: absentee ballot envelopes in North Carolina fit into, quote, a pattern of fraud. Why don't we start with that? Because it's a pretty major story. And, well, the talk of the Twitters the last couple of days is, why isn't this a bigger story? And I think it is a pretty big story. And I think it's getting a lot of press coverage. It's just, I don't know. It's not the only thing going on, obviously, but I don't know. It doesn't seem to grab people, which is odd. And I mean, I understand the complaint. I think I have the same complaint too. After all of the actual policy changes put in place over abstract fears about a non-existent voter fraud problem, why would there be no equivalent freakout? And I guess that's the complaint, is that the freakout hasn't been equivalent when you find something like this. And I don't know exactly what's driving it. It's sort of, it would be easy to lay it at the feet of a sort of conservative bias or a bias in the press for allowing conservatives to hype their stories more than they allow liberals and progressives to hype their stories. Although I don't know if we want to be hyping them, you want to be telling them straight, whatever. But I guess you could argue that the widespread reaction to the false story about voter fraud made it perhaps a larger national story, but it's only been detected in this one district. Although, if you really wanted to make a bigger deal out of this story, and I think we should, I wonder. I have no evidence of it, and that's the great difficulty here but it seems to me that if a fraud this overt, really, and this blatant could be uncovered in, a random district, North Carolina 9, I wonder whether it's happening elsewhere. Although, the statistical anomaly that tipped them off in North Carolina 9, anyway, it does not appear to be present elsewhere in North Carolina. That's what makes it an anomaly, and that's what allowed them to discover this. So, on the one hand, you'd think, well, if you really could just pull a stunt like this, why wouldn't other people be trying it elsewhere? And on the other hand, you say, well, we discovered this stunt because the data was itself the evidence that something had happened, and the data doesn't appear, or no one has come forward with data that appears to allege something else is worth considering or worth investigating elsewhere. But then again, we haven't run the data on all of these districts, and I'm not going to be the one to do that. I'm not certain whether that's number crunching that's worth doing, but I guess everything's worth checking at this point. So if you're a number cruncher data kind of person, you might think about taking this up, especially if you suspect such fraud or the potential for such fraud. And some states, I think, are probably more susceptible to it than others. Anyway, rather than the speculation, we'll stick to what's being reported here in this story. Exclusive: absentee ballot envelopes in North Carolina fit into a pattern of fraud. The congressional race in North Carolina's 9th District, where Republican Mark Harris is leading Democrat Dan McCready by just 905 votes. And if anybody knows whether there's a different pronunciation of McCready, let me know. Well, it has drawn national attention because of highly unusual patterns in mail-in absentee ballots. We've discussed some of those, and they're recapped here. In Bladen County, for example, only 19% of mail-in absentee ballots were requested by Republicans, but Harris won 61% of the mail-in absentee ballot vote. In every other county, including Republican strongholds like Union County, McCready won the mail-in absentee vote. So, what happened? The envelopes of the absentee ballots are a rich source of information because they require not only the signature of the voter, but the signatures of 2 witnesses. Really? Pending an investigation by the North Carolina State Board of Elections, which voted unanimously against certifying the election, these envelopes have been impounded. Under normal circumstances, however, these envelopes are available at the local election board for review as public information. Good thing to keep in mind, especially if you're considering crunching numbers. Before the Board of Elections action, 162 of the absentee ballot envelopes were photocopied. Popular Information obtained the images of these envelopes through a source. Very mysterious. A source. Jerry Cohen, the former special counsel for the North Carolina General Assembly and an expert in the state's election law, told Popular Information the envelopes, quote, fit within a pattern of fraud. Let's find out what that's all about. Typically, there would be a wide variety of witnesses for absentee ballots. A random assortment of voters chose to vote by mail-in absentee and then have family, friends, or co-workers serve as witnesses. The ballots obtained by popular information, however, show that a small group of people served as witnesses for these Bladen County ballots. Some of the witnesses signed more than 40 absentee envelopes. Now, there are circumstances under which I could imagine this happening and having it be perfectly legitimate, but you would have to come up with those stories yourself. I'm not going to feed them to you necessarily, but you could probably imagine one yourself. And it becomes more difficult to believe that that's what happened, that any of those legitimate scenarios are what happened when you read further into the story. Several of the witnesses are related to Leslie McCrae Dowless. Remember, the bad guy from yesterday's story. The man at the center of the controversy, who has previously been convicted of felony fraud. In 2016, McCrae Dowless admitted to running an operation where he paid people for each absentee ballot they were able to collect. The operating, that's what it says, the operating allegedly involved. The operation allegedly involved paying people to obtain absentee ballots, fill them out, and cast their votes on someone else's behalf, according to the expose on This American Life. In all, a group of just 8 witnesses appear on over 130 of the 162 ballot envelopes obtained by popular information. Here's a summary. There was a person by the name of Woody Hester who witnessed 45 absentee ballots. James Singletary witnessed 43. Lisa Britt, who shares an address with Sandra Dowless of the McCrae Dowless family, witnessed 44 absentee ballots. Ginger Easton witnessed 31. Jessica Dowless witnessed 15 absentee ballots. Let's see. Cheryl Kinlaw witnessed 14. Deborah Edwards, 11. And Sandra Dowless, 10 ballots. So just among the Dowless family and those who share an address with the Dowlesses, we have 44, 54, 59, 69. 69 of 162 absentee ballots have Dowlesses as witnesses or people who share addresses with them. Lisa Britt would be included there. In many cases, these witnesses were working in concert. James Singletary and Lisa Britt, for example, witnessed almost 30 ballots together. That's interesting too. And there are a couple copies of the certifications of 2 or 3 of the ballots, and lo and behold, they do appear to have been witnessed by both Lisa Britt and James Singletary. In isolation, there is nothing illegal about witnessing multiple absentee ballots in North Carolina, but Jerry Cohen said that the absentee ballot envelopes are part of a pattern. Cohen pointed to the fact that many mail-in absentee ballots in Bladen arrived at the election board in clumps, and affidavits from voters submitted to the State Board of Elections alleging canvassers collected unsealed absentee ballots. Those facts, along with the witness data from the envelopes, suggests there was a coordinated effort to take possession of absentee ballots, which is illegal, all by itself, I would add to that. You're just not supposed to be handling other people's ballots. J. Michael Bitzer, a professor at Catawba College, whose analysis of the anomalies in the North Carolina vote was his analysis first revealed potential problems, agreed that the ballot envelopes showed obvious coordination to bring forward ballots. Bitzer called the patterns of witnesses on the envelopes remarkable and agreed that they fit into the mosaic establishing potential fraud. Getting broader in our language here, Bitzer said that after reviewing the envelopes, a key question was whether there were other ballots collected in a similar fashion that were not delivered. Bladen County had an unusually high percentage of ballots that were requested and not returned. According to Bitzer, the individuals who repeatedly appear on envelopes as witnesses should be at the top of the list when the Board of Elections conducts its investigation. Bitzer is interested in whether any of the witnesses assisted voters in filling out the ballots, which is also against the law. There was an update to the story. After the publication of the story, Charlotte reporter Joe Bruno spoke with one of the witnesses, Ginger Eason, I think she was listed as, or I read her out as Easton before, but it must be, it's actually Eason. So let's see. A discussion with one of the witnesses. And how many did she do? I'm going to scroll back on her. She was good for 31. She's a witness on 31 of the ballots. And she admitted to being part of a ballot harvesting scheme. And that is probably a very unfortunate use of the phrase ballot harvesting, because, of course, that now gives still current Speaker of the House, Paul Ryan, and others who were signing on to his conspiracy theory about what was going on in California, a foothold to equate the practice known as ballot harvesting in California, which is apparently, according to the first stories we read about it anyway, the practice of going through the ballots that were validly received and making sure that any that were set aside over questions about their validity have the questions answered and the votes inside them counted if they pass muster, as opposed to just letting them sit on the side and saying, well, hopefully the margin in each of these races will grow larger than the number of ballots we have yet to count, so it won't matter how we determine the validity of those ballots, and we'll never have to go through those hard questions. But instead, in California, I guess the practice is to put an emphasis on making sure the votes are counted, whether they were necessary or not. And that would appear to be a legal and legitimate procedure for what they ended up calling ballot harvesting. But it could just as easily have been the case that you would lay that label on the idea of going around and knocking on doors and asking people to hand over their ballots that you allegedly will be turning over on their behalf to the State Board of Elections. You could call that ballot harvesting. You shouldn't call both of them ballot harvesting. That will only create confusion. So that seems like an unfortunate turn of phrase. I'm not certain where it originated, but if it didn't originate with Judd, he should probably put a correction in there about that. All right. Well, again, so the update is Charlotte reporter Joe Bruno speaking with one of the witnesses, Ginger Eason. She admitted to being a part of this scheme, whatever you call it, and the quote from his piece is thus: Bruno then visited Ginger Eason. She told him why her name appeared so many times as a witness. I was helping McCrae pick up ballots, Eason said. Well, that's actually open and shut. She probably thought that she wasn't admitting to anything illegal at all. I was just helping people vote. Mr. McCrae, and again, it's weird, like, what is that guy's name? I'm not really sure. Some people call him McCrae, and some people call him McCrae. So his name is Leslie McCrae Dowless Jr. McCrae, did the people call him that? Maybe they're referring to him as his first name. A lot of times people who, for whatever reason, either don't like their first names, or they are a junior or a third or whatever it is, and they try and distinguish themselves from their father, or in some cases, I guess, mother, by going by some nickname or their middle name or the nickname for the third, Trey, very popular down in the South. Let's see. But, so I was helping McCrae pick up ballots, and Ginger, I don't know whether Ginger knew that was illegal or not. Eason said Leslie McCrae Dowless Jr. paid her $75 to $100 a week to go around and pick up finished absentee ballots. 5 of the witnesses listed an apartment at 303 Pecan Street, or as they would say perhaps in the South, Pecan Street, as their address. Bruno spoke to the landlord, and only one of them lived there. It's a 1-bedroom apartment. So that's interesting. So even before Lisa Britt could still share an address with, who was it? Sandra Dowless. I don't know who Sandra is. Unless Sandra, of course, if Sandra Dowless is McCrae Dowless's wife, then it seems unlikely, but hey, I'm not going to get in the middle of their family situation. But okay. 5 of the witnesses, though, to list an apartment at 303 Pecan Street, a one-bedroom apartment, that does seem less than likely. And here then is embedded a Joe Bruno tweet. I guess he's Joe Bruno WSOC 9, appropriate for the 9th District. That's not what the 9 is for. But each witness has to include their address when they sign. He tweets, 5 people listed the same address on Pecan Street in the Village Oak Apartments. The landlord told me only one of the 5 people is a tenant. Also of note, the place the 5 claim to live is a one-bedroom apartment, so it would be tight quarters in there. But if they were collecting ballots 24/7 and just taking shifts, sleeping, let's say, 2 at a time for 8 hours, I think they could make it work. But that doesn't seem like it was that well-oiled a machine. McRae doubtless finally spoke, but he's not saying much. Another Joe Bruno tweet here, by phone on the ground at his work. I've been trying to get in touch with McRae Dowless for days. Finally, this afternoon, he poked his head out the side door and told me this as I repeatedly asked him some questions. And what did he tell him? At this time, I have no comment. Have a great day. So, yeah, not much to be said for that one. Okay. So, pretty good. An interesting update. And, yeah, more reason to be suspicious about these things. Plenty of other stories. Let's move on for the moment to this Politico piece, which I think we could probably discuss before our break and then maybe shift directions. But just to update you, Judge greenlights subpoenas in Trump hotel lawsuit. Lorraine Wallert and Josh Gerstein report for Politico. A federal judge on Monday said lawyers for Maryland and Washington, D.C., as official entities, I guess, can begin issuing subpoenas in a lawsuit that accuses President Donald Trump of using his luxury, and we should probably put that in quotes, hotel in Washington to unconstitutionally profit from his political office. That would, of course, be emoluments that we're talking about. The attorneys general in Maryland and Washington say they plan to serve as many as 20 companies and government agencies with subpoenas by midday Tuesday. It's the first time a lawsuit alleging a president violated the Constitution's emoluments or anti-corruption clauses has advanced to the discovery stage. I guess we'd be talking about domestic emoluments in this particular case. A similar suit against Trump brought by Democratic lawmakers cleared an initial hurdle in federal court in Washington, while a pair of suits filed in New York were thrown out by a judge there. That decision is on appeal. None of the cases has proceeded to the discovery stage yet. The Justice Department on Friday said it would try to halt the Attorney General case with an appeal to the Fourth Circuit Court of Appeals in Richmond, but by Monday night it had yet to file anything in that court. The department said it plans to seek a writ of mandamus, a process that would halt the legal proceedings as illegal or improper. Interesting. You don't often see mandamus handled that way. I'm used to seeing mandamus being used to force a government department to do something, as opposed to a government department using mandamus to force a department of a different government, state governments, to stop doing things. Usually you would, well, I don't know. I guess you could use mandamus for that, but whatever. Interesting. A DOJ spokeswoman declined to comment on the decision Monday. There was no immediate word on when the Fourth Circuit appeal would be filed. Subpoenas will be issued to state and federal agencies and to customers and competitors of the Trump International Hotel, located just down the street from the White House. Maryland Attorney General Brian Frosch said, if Justice Department lawyers do seek to stop the case, he said he was confident that the delay would be temporary. They have a very high burden to win on a writ of mandamus, so I don't think they can meet that standard here, Frosch told Politico. They've done everything they possibly can to stop us from getting discovery. And by the way, is everybody familiar with what discovery is? We do mention it quite a lot, and I don't think we've ever really defined what it is. But it is that stage, pre-trial stage of the game where if it looks like everything is, on the up and up in terms of the likelihood of success and, no one's preliminary motions to dismiss the case succeed. Discovery is where the sides question one another, subpoena material, information, etc., and try to get a hold of everything that they have a right to from the other side under disclosure rules, so that they can put all the cards on the table. All the fact cards are now on the table. Everyone knows what they're going to be dealing with and what they're going to be arguing about before the trial begins. Discovery, it's just what it sounds like. I want to discover what is in your files about the way you did business, and everything that I am entitled to, you're supposed to turn over to me. We'll fight to some degree in almost every trial about how much I'm actually entitled to and what you think you're entitled to protect because it's somehow proprietary information or otherwise privileged information, and I say it isn't, and we argue about it and fight over it with the judge. The discovery phase is that phase in which we finally determine what facts will be available to argue about when it comes time to have the trial. And subpoenas serve the purpose then of demanding that certain materials be handed over, or that certain people make themselves available for questioning by the attorneys from the other side, and your attorneys are there too, of course. And so that's where they develop those preliminary question and answer sets that very often come up at trial. They ask questions like, well, you're saying now, for instance, in front of the jury that you didn't do this thing, but at discovery stage, when we subpoenaed you, we asked you this question and you admitted that you might have actually done that. Are you telling the truth now, or were you telling the truth then, or were you lying now? Which one is it? That's what's going on at the discovery stage. So we're finally going to get to that, and that's the stage at which most people find out, I think I've made a horrible mistake, and I'm going to be exposed here, and I'd like to settle. That's coming up next. Hi everybody, it's me, David. Let's change things up from the old fundraising pitch for just a minute and talk instead about how you can be a part of our show. If you've got a smartphone or any other electronic recording device, why not sit down and record a segment for us? Read us an important article and give us your take. Read one of your own original essays, or even just give us your commentary on something you'd like to share that's important to you. Then send the file to me at kagrox@gmail.com, and I'll try and work it into the show. Short segments, a few minutes in length, are easiest to fit in. And of course, I can't always guarantee that I'll be able to play everything, but if you've ever shouted at your radio or TV about something you wish was being covered, here's your chance to change that. Make the show your own. Send your submissions to me at kagrox@gmail.com. Welcome back now to the Kagro in the Morning Show here on Netroots Radio. Just by way of update on North Carolina 09, the keen eye of Andrew Kaczynski over at CNN lets us know that the over at Fox News, Fox and Friends, is spending a considerable amount of time on this. But I don't mean the North Carolina 9 segment. This is his count of the number of Christmas toy banana gifts segments on Fox is 1, whereas the number of segments on North Carolina's 9th Congressional District is still 0. Apparently there are a number of toy bananas, the peels of which, when pulled back, reveal surprises inside. That is very important. And of course, yeah, so they're spending some time, three inexplicably very blonde women are on television with a display of gifts. But, that's a morning news thing around this time. They spend lots of time in the morning shows talking about the hot Christmas gifts. But, yeah, you'd think that they could give some time over to the story of North Carolina 09. We did, though, again, we haven't helped anybody out with their Christmas gift shopping just yet. So, you tell me which is the more valuable in terms of coverage. Okay, but we'll return to that in just a moment. Let's continue on and get to the end of the emoluments lawsuit story, now that we all understand, I hope, what discovery is all about. So where were we here? Subpoenas will be issued to state and federal government agencies and to customers and competitors of the Trump International Hotel, right? And of course, the Maryland Attorney General, Brian Frosh, saying it doesn't seem to him like their mandamus ploy is likely to work. We will see. D.C. Attorney General Karl Racine called the Constitution's emoluments clauses our nation's original anti-corruption laws, and that they are. A spokeswoman from the Trump Organization, Amanda Miller, and by the way, it's important to remember that the Trump Organization still exists out there. The foundation has been largely disassembled, but can still be sued. But it's a good point to remember as the Mueller stuff goes forward, since so much of the collusion story, finally, it's now being established. I think we've always speculated that was the case, but apparently it was always just speculation, and everybody else is only just now catching up in terms of proof. But because there was such overlap between the political and the personal and the business interests, the fact that there's a Donald Trump campaign, a Donald Trump-owned Trump organization, and then, of course, the Donald J. Trump Foundation, and probably, well, any number of other corporate entities, since he owned so many one-dimensional shell corporations in order to accomplish the business of the Trump organization. That's really neither here nor there, but there are so many entities that can be investigated, sued, pursued in whatever fashion by investigators, whether it be Mueller or other federal investigators or state-level investigators, whatever. It's important to keep that in mind, even if the claim ends up being made that you can't indict a sitting president. I don't know that it's been the case that a sitting president has been so closely connected with so many otherwise eminently indictable entities in our history before, because of course you're supposed to disassociate yourself from all those entities. He has refused to do so, and so he remains pretty exposed, I think, to liability, and liability that will carry his name, because in his ego, he labeled almost everything with the Trump name. So something named Trump is going to get in trouble here, and something named Trump is going to go on trial, whether it's the president personally or not. Anyway, moving on, a spokeswoman for the Trump Organization, Amanda Miller, didn't respond to any requests for comment. The White House did not immediately respond to requests for comment. The suit, filed in June of 2017, accuses Trump of violating two emoluments clauses of the Constitution, there you have it, which limit the president's ability to receive financial benefits from states and foreign governments. The Trump Organization says it is donating to the U.S. Treasury profits from hotel businesses with foreign governments, but it hasn't explained how those amounts are calculated. And I guess I would also say one other layer of possibilities, I guess, revealed by noting the fact that he has multiple entities that could be handling the business for all this. I'm not certain that it means a whole lot when the Trump Organization says it's donating to the Treasury. It says profits from the hotel business. But if they mean, oh, well, we meant our profits for it, would that mean, to you and I, that would mean, okay, all the profits made from the operation of the hotel and what would we say? Doing business with any foreign governments, any profits that come from that, which would be a hard enough thing to calculate if things were straightforward, would be donated to the Treasury. And we have no way of tracking it. We have no way of knowing whether they're calculating it correctly. We have no way of knowing whether they're declaring everything. On top of all of that, it wouldn't take much. It would take a smart lawyer, and somehow the Trump Organization finds themselves in short supply on good lawyers, or at least the ones who are out front are no good. But the ones I think they keep back in New York are a little bit better. Michael Cohen was a disaster, but more on him later. Anyway, it wouldn't take very much for them to manipulate things such that, okay, most of the profits of the hotel are actually in the hands of something that he might not even necessarily have slapped the Trump label on, one of the more obscure shell corporations. So it could be, Old Post Office Project 1 LLC is handling the profits, and that the Trump organization itself gets a small slice, perhaps, of the profits, and those it may or may not actually be tracking and donating to the U.S. Treasury. But the other profits that might be held by a differently named shell corporation might be excluded from their version of what it means to say that the Trump organization is donating to the U.S. Treasury profits from the hotel business with foreign governments. Just putting that out there. I imagine that the Mueller investigators would be pretty thorough about that. I'm just saying you might one day see that story in print and be shocked if you were not a listener to our show. But that can't happen because if you weren't a listener to our show, you wouldn't be hearing that now. Is time travel possible? We'll look into that in the next segment. Finally, Judge Peter J. Messitte, I'm guessing, Messitte, who was appointed by President Bill Clinton, rejected earlier arguments from the Justice Department attorneys that Maryland and D.C. lacked legal standing to pursue the emoluments case. He also ruled against Trump's lawyers' argument that the emoluments clauses exclude private business transactions. Of course they don't. Last month, he denied Trump's request for an appeal in the case. Lawyers from Cohen, Milstein, Gupta, Wessler, and the nonprofit Citizens for Responsibility and Ethics in Washington, or CREW, are assisting Racine and Frosch on the litigation. So, an important update, just so we know where we stand with all of that stuff. Let's see. Any more interesting news about toy bananas? No, it doesn't appear to be happening. But as we were discussing North Carolina 9th District, interesting observations made along the way. Let's see if I can properly identify all the people playing in that chain. But I mentioned to you that there were some other stories yesterday that we would have to get some more background information on going on in Wisconsin and in Michigan. And we were comparing them briefly yesterday to power grabs undertaken in, of all places, North Carolina, when North Carolina's governor's mansion changed party hands from Republican to Democrat. The North Carolina state government, as I recall, made some mad dash to strip the North Carolina courts, which also had turned over to majority Democratic control, and the governorship of their traditional powers, so that Republican policymaking done when they held the trifecta could not be undone. Similar projects now underway in Wisconsin and Michigan. But with respect to this North Carolina 9th District story, I thought it was, interesting that Atrios was just sort of taking a look at this thing and, a wider view of a lot of things, including, I guess he had first been reacting to, this, how far back does this go? It seems to be playing off of quite a few things from yesterday as well. He's first reacting to a tweet from John Whitehouse, who tweets as Existential Fish, and who is the news director at Media Matters. His note that the New York Times starting to maybe potentially realize that the both sides frame might not work, and he tweets a screenshot of a New York Times politics section headline, "In the age of Trump, can scandal still sink a politician?" 2 bullet points that then read, President Trump has defied the old conventions and troublesome pasts and political careers. And a second bullet that says it's unclear whether the same rules apply to the Democrats running to unseat him. And That's actually quite an astute observation, finally, from the New York Times. Atrios commenting on that. Where do these rules come from? Spontaneous committees set up by customers of Ohio diners? Or the choices of the political desks of your major media outlets? It's hard to be sure. It's really not hard to be sure, of course. We know this very well. The next tweet in Atrios's timeline switches gears just slightly, but I don't know. It seemed like it flowed from one piece to another. He then retweets James Fallows, who writes here a reminder of how powerful the both sides instinct remains. A mainstream political newsletter. So we had there just a moment ago John Whitehouse saying the Times might finally be realizing that both sides doesn't always work. However, James reminding us it's still pretty powerful. A reminder of how powerful the both sides instinct remains. A mainstream political newsletter, and I'm not sure which one. I can't identify it just from sight. Discussing 3 aggressive GOP moves to take power from incoming Democratic governors in Wisconsin and Michigan. See, which is what I was talking about. And suspicion of vote fraud in North Carolina 09 sets it up this way. Okay. I guess if I were a more conscientious consumer of the newsletter, I would note from the format which one this is. All right. So first, some italicized type up top with some added highlighting. We'll try and emphasize the highlighted parts for you. Amid remembrances of political honor, what's playing out in Wisconsin, Michigan, and North Carolina, and I guess political honor referring to the death of George H.W. Bush, and we're all rah-rahing about what a stand-up guy he supposedly was, and political honor. And amid remembrances of political honor, what's playing out in Wisconsin, Michigan, and North Carolina are reminders, and here we are highlighted, of today's rotten partisanship. Georgia today holds its runoff for Secretary of State. Did Trump engage in witness tampering in the Russia probe? Another question that they'll be addressing in their newsletter, I guess. If Trump seems rattled now, get ready for the next few weeks. Congress avoids a government shutdown for 2 weeks. Oh, I knew it was going to be 2 weeks. And yes, so I guess that does mean that the president has acquiesced to a CR, and 2 weeks is the usual can-kicking distance, temporal distance, I guess, that they apply to these things. So then the next section of this screenshot says first thoughts. So those of you who are close readers of the mainstream political newsletters will probably know immediately that this is the what? I don't know. NBC piece, the Axios guys. I don't know. I don't remember, but it's Greg probably knows. Anyway, again, amid remembrances of political honor, what's playing out in Wisconsin, Michigan, and North Carolina today are reminders of today's rotten partisanship. For all the talk of honor, dignity, and respect as the country mourns and remembers former President George H.W. Bush, the exact opposite of honor, dignity, and respect is playing out in Wisconsin, Michigan, and North Carolina. Keep saying the states over and over again. It says again, reminders of how rotten our politics have become. Can I just say something about the editing of this newsletter? I've read 2 paragraphs here, and I've read the same sentence 3 times. All right. In Wisconsin, per the AP, Republicans yesterday advanced their efforts after their election losses to take powers away from the incoming Democratic governor and state attorney general. Our politics, even back during Bush 41's days, have never been pretty. Remember Lee Atwater and Willie Horton, or the Clarence Thomas confirmation hearings? But 30 years after that brutal 1988 presidential campaign, it's only getting worse and worse, is the highlighted section. And I got to tell you, that is the most unhelpful, uninsightful political newsletter I have ever read, and I don't even know which one it is. But it's true. It's a good reminder, I guess, of you know what? I'm not even sure exactly what the hell it reminds us of, because all I read was the same sentence over and over again. But I guess the point James was trying to make was that I guess all they're saying over and over and over is rotten partisanship and, oh, we're so divided. And I guess the implication of it just being politics and partisanship in general, rather than saying, hey, Republicans are doing all three of the terrible things in this compilation of like stories. Why they don't say they're examples of rotten Republican partisanship, but instead it's, I guess, supposed to be a both sides story. It's interesting. And Atrios commenting on that one. Republicans don't even have to try to get reporters to do this for them. They just do it. And I guess that's definitely true and interesting and worth taking note of. Also, somehow in the middle of this stream of thoughts from Atrios is Oliver Willis's tweet that says, I don't understand why we're not getting the mail because George H.W. Bush died. It makes no sense. It does strike me as odd. I don't remember. I mean, I really don't remember. I have not paid attention. Did they declare the federal government closed for a holiday for a day of mourning for the passing of other presidents? It's been a while. Who's the last former president to have passed away? I can't recall. It might happen every single time. I just don't remember it happening that way, and maybe because it was somehow unremarkable. I don't know. But all right. Well, so we're not getting the mail. I think Wednesday was the day they were closing for all that. Okay. So for me, around here, that means less traffic, basically. A federal holiday makes commutes to your private workplace, which doesn't close, that happens to be in the greater D.C. metropolitan area, much easier. That means my wife is home sooner, so terrific. I love it when the government closes. Okay. Of course, I don't think schools will be closed. The kids will have to go to that, but those are under local and state control instead. So there you have it. He wasn't the president of any of those things. Just as well. The kids don't need to get involved in this. Okay. So let's see. Other stories I wanted to bring up to date here. Let's see. I grabbed some stories from closer to home on these questions of what's going on in Wisconsin and Michigan. So we'll start with the Wisconsin one because I grabbed that one first. And I have John Nichols writing for The Nation here, and he's, of course, sitting right in the middle of all this, so it's probably wise to start with him rather than, say, going over to the Washington Post on this thing. Scott Walker's sore loser scheme, shaken by November 6th losses. Wisconsin Republicans seek to change election dates, restrict voting, and limit high turnout elections before they relinquish power. And before I launch into this one, I just should say, I also saw circulating on Twitter today. Let's see. And as a matter of fact, I think I left it off just here. When I was saying that Atrios' stream of thoughts about this stuff was continuing over from last night, there was the observation among many people who made this observation. Greg Green had tweeted this one out. Let's see. The New York Times, in their headlines on what was happening in North Carolina, basically, how did they frame it? Here it is. Here's the quote. Facing electoral reverses, some Republicans took action to shore up strength before Democrats could vote. I see. That's the. I see what you're talking about here. All right, I've confused the two things here. The earlier New York Times pieces on what was going on in Wisconsin and Michigan seemed to frame it that way. That facing electoral reverses, some Republicans took action to shore up strength before Democrats take over, I guess, in their states. And the complaint was, yeah, what do you mean shore up strength? One, they don't have any strength. They just lost it in the election. And two, they don't have anything to shore up here. I mean, all they're doing is, it's not shoring anything up. They're just stealing power away from Democrats. They're not even necessarily exercising it themselves. They're just making sure that Democrats can't exercise it even though they just won the election. And Greg is parodying that by talking about North Carolina's situation. They would probably be writing, if they wrote along the same lines in the New York Times, was that facing electoral reverses, some Republicans took action to shore up strength before Democrats could vote. That's why they stole their absentee ballots and tossed them out. We're just shoring up our strength here in this district we're about to lose. Okay. So that puts that in context. I wanted to get that line out there. I know a lot of people have been talking about that, even though I mangled it horribly. I wasn't prepared. I tried to wing it. Didn't work. You get what I was going at, I hope. If not, we'll just mumble something and go into the John Nichols story, and then you'll understand Wisconsin. And having understood that, you'll forget about not understanding what I was babbling about a minute ago. Wisconsin Governor Scott Walker lost his bid for re-election. His failed presidential run, his crooked financial deals, and his unpopular policies weakened Walker in the eyes of the electorate and finally took him down. And his fellow Republicans lost with him. In a high turnout election that saw a record 2.7 million voters cast midterm ballots, Walker's team was trounced. Every statewide Republican candidate was defeated for Attorney General, for Secretary of State, for State Treasurer, for Lieutenant Governor, and that was only the latest set of rough election results for Wisconsin Republicans. Earlier in the year, in another high turnout election, a state Supreme Court candidate backed by Walker and his allies won just 44% of the vote, losing what had been a conservative seat on the high court. On the same day, the governor's attempt to eliminate the office of state treasurer was rejected by a 62-38 margin, and in special elections for state Senate seats, Republicans lost districts where they had not been defeated in decades. What's this with eliminating the office of the state treasurer? That's a pretty basic function. The only thing that saved Wisconsin Republicans from a total wipeout in 2018 was gerrymandering. Despite the fact that 54% of November 6th voters preferred Democratic state legislative candidates, Republicans secured 63 of 99 assembly seats, thanks to what Common Cause in Wisconsin refers to as, quote, one of the most partisan gerrymanders of any state legislature in the nation in the last 50 years. Again, the Dems won 54% of the vote. Republicans won 63% of the seats. That's pretty aggressive. The results reaffirmed the truth of Wisconsin Assembly Democratic leader Gordon Heinz's assertion that his candidates were, quote, competing on the most uneven playing field in the United States, unquote. Republican Assembly Speaker Robin Vos, Walker's chief legislative henchman, tried to spin the results as, quote, a mandate for his caucus. But his claim was undermined by his actions. Since the election results were announced, Vos has been working with Republicans who still control the state Senate to undermine the authority of the Democrats who won statewide, and, most significantly, to reduce the prospects for future high turnout elections. The changes that they propose to enact this week in a rushed lame duck session of the legislature are dramatic and dangerous. They've drawn loud protests from newspapers that usually back Republicans, good government groups, and citizens who have rallied at the state capitol, and they're big into rallying at their state capitol there in Wisconsin. You remember that. The newly elected governor of Wisconsin, Democrat Tony Evers, calls the scheme to take key policy-making and appointment powers away from him and from newly elected Democratic Attorney General Josh Kaul, K-A-U-L, another embarrassment for Wisconsin, a historically progressive state that has seen its reputation badly damaged by the constant maneuvering of Walker and his fellow Republicans to undermine voting rights and consolidate power. The last election changed the state in a way that apparently the legislature has decided not to accept. They are putting their interests in front of the people of the state of Wisconsin, said Evers, who promised to, take any steps possible to assure the people of Wisconsin that I will not invalidate those votes. Republicans are running scared, and what scares them is democracy. Walker, Vos, and Republican Senate Majority Leader Scott Fitzgerald have come to fear the voters. They are afraid that their Republican Party can no longer win in fair elections. They worry that their ideology, their conservative faith once advanced by Barry Goldwater and Ronald Reagan, can no longer compete in the battle of ideas. In large measure, they are correct, as it has bent to the demands of Donald Trump, the grand old party that was founded in Wisconsin in 1854, has fallen on hard times. Wisconsin wasn't the only state where things went sour for the GOP. The November 6th election results saw Republicans lose control of the U.S. House with the worst midterm losses since the Watergate era, as well as 7 governorships and more than 300 state legislative seats nationwide. But the pattern in Wisconsin has been especially unsettling for the Republicans, and they know that redistricting following the 2020 census will undo their gerrymandered advantages if ongoing litigation does not upset the warped district lines even more quickly. Walker is a political careerist who obsesses over election data. So too are Voss and Fitzgerald. They are savvy enough to recognize that their party is in crisis. They must recognize as well that the conservative movement that has sustained the GOP in recent decades has, with the surrender of principles and ideals to the service of Trumpism, struggled under the weight of its own hypocrisy. Walker, Fitzgerald, and Voss could take up the difficult work of remaking their party and their movement, adjusting approaches to respond to changing times and new challenges, but that would require these desperate men to put their faith in their own abilities and the abilities of the candidates they support, to appeal to the voters in free and fair elections. I don't know, we keep finding some extraneous words in these days of, lax editing. Unfortunately, in Wisconsin and in other states where Democrats are on the rise, such as North Carolina and Michigan, these names keep coming up, Republicans have chosen a cruder course. They are exploiting their lingering power to undermine democracy itself. Among other things, they are proposing to dramatically restrict early voting procedures that have played a critical role in increasing voter turnout in Wisconsin. While communities in the state can now maintain early voting on a flexible 6-week schedule that is designed to encourage high levels of voter participation, the GOP plan would shift to a far more restrictive 2-week schedule. And they're not stopping there. The Republicans are also scheming to preserve conservative control of the state Supreme Court by changing 2020 election dates in order to avoid a high turnout election when a court seat is chosen on April 7th of that year. Specifically, they propose to move the state's presidential primaries, which are expected to draw high interest, especially, though not necessarily exclusively, from Democrats, from April 7th to March 10th. Why? So that Governor Walker's untested appointee to the court will have an easier time. Welcome back now to the Kagro in the Morning Show here on Roots Radio. Whoops, and I think I've pressed, clicked on the wrong thing. I wanted to grab yet another story that was floating by that I thought I would perhaps add to the mix, and as I went to click it, Twitter moved along because more of you said things, and we didn't get a chance to grab all those. Although, I don't know whether we'll get to this one or not. It's more about Wisconsin, and I think we're pretty up to date by taking John Nichols' view of things. But where we left off was Wisconsin thinking of moving its presidential primary to a different date so that there won't be so much interest in getting to the polls on a day when Governor Walker's, as they say here, untested appointee to the court, who is, by the way, conservative judicial activist Daniel Kelly, won't face the large crowds of Democrats who are there to vote in the presidential primary and will vote on the question of Supreme Court nominations as well, if they happen to be there. Now, if they have to come back out again on April 7th, after having been to the polls for the presidential primary on March 10th, they may not show up, and a low turnout election, I guess they figure, favors Walker's man, Kelly, in this situation. Wisconsin's county clerks have warned that scheduling a new election in order to protect Kelly will cost taxpayers dearly, and you know how fiscally conservative Governor Walker is. Perhaps as much as $7 million, by the way, would be cost here, and it'll also create confusion for voters and lead to logistical nightmares for clerks and poll workers. This is all true, but the more serious issue is the signal such a change would send regarding respect for the will of the people. As newly elected Lieutenant Governor Mandela Barnes says, people didn't vote in record numbers just to have representatives from gerrymandered districts work to further subvert democracy. If Walker, Voss, and Fitzgerald get away with attacking the infrastructure of high turnout elections in Wisconsin by restricting early voting and changing election dates, you can bet that Republicans in other states will embrace this darkly anti-democratic strategy. Very likely the case. The piece I grabbed as we were coming back from break is Dan Kaufman's New York Times opinion piece. Wisconsin is about to make a huge mistake. I've made a huge mistake. I like the phrasing. Let's see if we learn anything more about the Wisconsin situation from his piece. Let's see. Late Friday afternoon, less than a month after a Democrat, Tony Evers, defeated Scott Walker, the incumbent Republican governor, Robin Vos, the Republican Speaker of the Wisconsin State Assembly, followed through on his threat to strip the new governor of some of his power. That day, an Assembly committee released 5 bills that grant sweeping new authority to the legislature at the expense of both Mr. Evers and Wisconsin's new Attorney General, Josh Kaul, who also just happens to be, a Democrat. This gets into, I think, a finer level of detail. I'm sure John Nichols covered that in the past and figured everybody who reads his column regularly was up to speed on these things, and I wish I had. Then I wouldn't have to do this one. But this is, I think, worth doing so far. Drafted in secret, the legislation was rushed to the Joint Finance Committee on Monday. Oh, yes, I've been getting a kick out of people tweeting about their presence at protests against the Joint Finance Committee, or JFC, which is it's really kind of funny as people are exclaiming how outrageous the power grab is and then using JFC, and I keep thinking they mean something entirely different than Joint Finance Committee. But that's where it ended up, and on Monday they had their only public hearing on it. Legislators and outraged citizens scrambled all weekend to parse more than 40 serious changes to state law embedded in the 141 pages of text. The legislature is expected to vote on the bills on Tuesday. That'd be today, I think. And Mr. Walker has indicated an openness to signing legislation of this stripe. No one is really bothering to hide the purpose of this lame duck legislation: to continue the Republicans' hold on state government, even at the expense of core democratic principles like respect for the separation of powers and majority rule. The legislation would nullify the decision-making of Wisconsin's voters who rejected Republicans for every statewide office in the November midterms. The lame duck legislation would, for example, prevent Mr. Evers, I guess the new governor, I'll straighten things out for you if you're not following along, prevent the new governor from fulfilling a campaign promise to take Wisconsin out of a multi-state lawsuit against the Affordable Care Act. So that's a big deal, living up to campaign promises. We know how much stock certain Democrats are putting in having made campaign promises for good reasons or bad to vote against Nancy Pelosi for Speaker. And I guess if it's serious enough for them to consider doing that, it would be a pretty serious problem for Mr. Evers to have to give up on a campaign promise to withdraw from this lawsuit if they somehow in the legislature make it impossible for him to do so. It will also diminish the governor's control over the Wisconsin Economic Development Corporation, a scandal-ridden public-private agency created by Mr. Walker to foster job creation by giving the legislature an equal number of appointees on the board as the governor and revoking the governor's power to appoint the board's chief executive. It's interesting. So they even create the thing at the behest of a Republican governor when the Democratic governor who defeats him says, I'd like to see this thing changed. It is, after all, a board of the governor's creation. They're going to suddenly turn it into a 50-50 prospect, or perhaps even 60-40 prospect. When it comes to operational control, it becomes a legislative creature all of a sudden. Mr. Evers campaigned on closing the agency, the subject of critical audits by the state's nonpartisan Legislative Audit Bureau, which revealed that the Economic Development Corporation had mismanaged millions of dollars in loans. The agency also attracted controversy after leading the effort to entice Foxconn, the Taiwanese electronics manufacturing contractor, to build its first American plant in Wisconsin at a cost to taxpayers now reaching more than $4.5 billion in subsidies. The lame duck legislation will also weaken the Attorney General's office by eliminating the Solicitor General's office in the state's Department of Justice. How do you do that? I mean, again, Solicitor General in the federal system, anyway, is that person whose job it is to actually show up before the Supreme Court and argue cases on behalf of the government. It's not always the Solicitor General himself, and sometimes it's deputies and assistants, etc. But, in general, I think you have to have an office charged with the responsibility of actually showing up in court on behalf of the state, don't you think? The legislature will also take away the Attorney General's power to determine how to spend settlement winnings and give that power to the legislature, because they're awesome with budgets. The bill also gives the legislature the right to effectively act as its own Attorney General by granting the Joint Committee on Legislative Organization the power to hire its own special counsel if it determines it is in the interests of the state to do so. Both Mr. Voss and Scott Fitzgerald, the Senate Majority Leader, who is collaborating closely with Mr. Voss, are, you'll never believe it, members of that committee. Apart from stripping powers from other branches of the government, the legislation aims to decrease voter turnout by imposing a 2-week limit on early voting, despite the fact that a federal judge struck down a similar Wisconsin law in 2016 on the grounds that it was racially discriminatory. We'll just try it again, though, because they said that you couldn't do it. They didn't say I couldn't do it. When Democrats swept statewide offices in November, it was mostly the result of record turnout in Dane and Milwaukee counties, Wisconsin's two largest, both of which allow early voting to begin roughly 6 weeks before an election. So it's been effective in the Democratic strongholds, so it's time to get rid of it. The legislature is the most representative branch in government. Mr. Voss and Mr. Fitzgerald wrote in a joint statement after the bills were released, it was meant to serve as a justification, but in Wisconsin, at least since 2011, that has not been true. That year, at a law office across the street from the state capitol, Republicans drew new redistricting maps in secret and without input from a single Democrat or member of the public. In 2016, a federal court ruled the maps are so excessively partisan as to be unconstitutional. The first time a court has made such a ruling on partisan grounds in 30 years. Earlier this year, the United States Supreme Court sent the case back to the lower courts, ruling that the plaintiffs did not have standing to sue. Thanks a lot, Supreme Court. Nationally, Democrats won more than 300 state legislative seats in November, but the party gained only 1 seat in the Wisconsin State Assembly, despite winning 54% of the aggregate statewide vote. That leaves Democrats with 36 out of the 99 seats. Since the 2011 redistricting, they have not held more than 39 of the 99 seats. In the state Senate, Democrats actually lost a seat, giving Republicans a 19-14 margin. The lame duck legislation also takes aim at lowering turnout for a state Supreme Court election scheduled for April 2020. We heard about this one. One measure would move the primary to March in order to avoid its being held on the same day as what is likely to be a crucial Democratic presidential primary. The cost of adding this new election is nearly $7 million, and the proposed date would make for 3 elections in 3 consecutive months. Last week, Dane County's clerk announced on social media that 60 of the state's 72 county clerks opposed the move. Mr. Fitzgerald admitted to reporters that the rationale for moving the election was to give a better chance to Daniel Kelly, whom Mr. Walker appointed to fill a vacant seat. Judge Kelly's election to a full 10-year term is essential to preserving the 4-3 conservative advantage on the Wisconsin Supreme Court. Like many Republican policies adopted in Wisconsin over the past 8 years, taking power from a Democratic executive is part of a national conservative strategy. In December of 2016, a few weeks after the election of Democratic Governor Roy Cooper in North Carolina, Republican legislative leaders significantly weakened the state's governorship. They went so far that at the beginning of this year's legislative session, a reporter asked Phil Berger, the Republican Senate President pro tempore, and Tim Moore, the Speaker of the House, if they plan to take away any more of Governor Cooper's powers. Does he still have any? Mr. Berger joked. If you have any suggestions, let us know, Mr. Moore added. Ha ha. So funny. In Michigan, where Democrats also won the governor's and attorney general's offices last month, the Republican-controlled legislature is debating divesting powers from both offices, including the attorney general's oversight of state campaign finance law. Perhaps fortified by the Republicans' gerrymandered advantage, Mr. Voss has been notably defiant. There's no doubt about it that the voters across Wisconsin affirmed our record, the record of our party, and the agenda that we have put forward over the past 8 years, he told the Assembly Republican caucus a few days after the election, despite Republicans losing all the statewide offices. We are the ones that were given a mandate to govern. I spoke to Mr. Evers last Friday, just before the bills were released. I also have a mandate to govern, Mr. Evers told me in response to Mr. Voss's comments, but we have to work together and solve things for the people of Wisconsin. What Speaker Voss says in caucus, I understand that he has to rally his troops. Wow. But after learning about the scope of the bills, oh good, there's a change, it sounds like. Mr. Evers was more assertive. I view this as a repudiation of the last election, he told the Milwaukee Journal-Sentinel. But again, the initial Democratic response is, well, we have to work together for the people and make progress. Fine. At least on second view, he sees it correctly. I just wonder why it takes so long. I will take any steps possible to assure the people of Wisconsin that I will not invalidate those votes. And frankly, I'm encouraging citizens across the state of Wisconsin to help me in that effort. Wow. What a rallying cry. Mr. Voss and Mr. Fitzgerald seem confident they can turn their self-proclaimed mandate into another chapter in their party's most enduring achievement, engineering its own dominance. Like their successful efforts to gut Wisconsin's campaign finance laws, decimate the labor movement, and weaken voting rights by enacting one of the country's strictest voter ID laws, seizing power from the state's newly elected governor and attorney general promises to further tilt the balance in the Republicans' favor. After 8 years of relentless attacks on Wisconsin's progressive political traditions, its state government has been transformed into something that is hard to recognize as a democracy. If these new bills pass, it will become harder still. All right. Well, recapped and good tips of the hat toward the stories elsewhere from Dan Kaufman here. Let's see. I think I also have some of the material on Michigan from, as you might expect, from Eclectablog. I keep making that mistake. It's Eclectablog, and it is eclectic, but I keep thinking of them in electa terms rather than eclectic terms. But our Twitter famous friend LOLGOP put this one together, and I think that it will help summarize not only what's going on, but where to turn if you are living in Michigan and looking to make your voice heard on the subject. Fight back against the Michigan GOP's sore loser attacks on workers, puppies, I don't know whether that might even be serious, and democracy. Michigan, where our GOP is almost as bad as Wisconsin's, and they're out and protesting even in Michigan too. It's not just Wisconsin. It begins after Michigan Republicans had their worst statewide wipeout since 1938. The profoundly and illegally gerrymandered GOP state, House, and Senate have launched a smash-and-grab attack on our democracy, our workers, our wetlands, and even our puppies. Again, I think that might be real in this kind. And I like the framing there, too. And it's been a couple days since people have been bringing this up and say, call it what it is. I think Greg Green, who got his name called earlier in the show, said, call it looting. On the way out the door, they're just smash and grab and take whatever they can for themselves. And it ought to be exposed as such. It's the worst I've ever seen, said Mark Brewer, former Michigan Democratic Party chair, in speaking to the GOTMFV show, Get Out the Vote show. You understand? MF were the letters missing from. In November, Michiganders voted to give themselves much easier access to the polls with an historic set of ballot reforms that go into effect in 2020 and an independent redistricting committee that will decide electoral maps for 2021. Recognizing that their anti-democratic hold on the state is at definite risk, Republicans are doing everything they can to extend that hold and punish the voters who came out en masse to rip it from them. The sore loser session of the Michigan House and Senate assaults on democracy will be challenged in the courts and possibly on future ballots, where the extraordinarily popular proposals voters wanted, like legal pot, are being gutted by an extraordinarily unpopular Republican politician. Well, but by extraordinarily unpopular Republican politicians. But this assault must also be challenged directly now, so at the very least, Michiganders know how badly they're being ripped off. And this is only possible because maps have given a minority of Michigan majority control of the state. In the Michigan State Senate, in the 2018 popular vote versus seats won contest, Democrats won 51% of the vote, and to the Republicans 47, and yet the number of seats is in the Senate 16 for Democrats, 22 for the GOP. In other words, 51-47 in the popular vote, corresponding to 42-58 split of the state Senate. 47% of the vote for Republicans, 58% of the seats. 51% of the vote for Democrats, 42% of the seats. That's probably the easiest way of expressing things. In the Michigan State House, same setup. Democrats win 52% of the vote, are awarded 47% of the seats. Republicans net 47% of the vote and are awarded 53% of the seats. So what should you do? We might as well get to that part here. 1. Check out all the damage they want to do while no one is watching. First, familiarize yourself with the GOP's attacks on one fair wage, earned sick time, public workers, the safety of the Great Lakes, wetlands, Props 1, 2, and 3. I'm not certain what they are, but those in Michigan certainly do. Power grabs from the Democratic women just elected to statewide office. And puppies. I got to get to the bottom of this puppies bit. Let me click on the link here. And WCDP, the Washtenaw County Democratic Party. Have I pronounced that one correctly? Washtenaw or Washtenaw? Where do you put your emphasis? Washtenaw. I'm going to guess that that's probably right. Seems like the proper pronunciation. Michigan Legislature lame duck issue overview on what you can do. So I'm skipping away from LOL GOP on Eclectablog over to the Washtenaw County Democrats on this one. Here's what's up, and we'll get to the bottom of the puppies thing, I hope, at some point. Let me scroll down. Yep, there it is. It's what you think. But a lame duck session. They explain what it is. And here's what's going on. The Republican-controlled legislature voted to approve the One Fair Wage ballot initiative, which increased the minimum wage, or would, I guess, if it's accepted, to $12 an hour, including tipped workers, with the intention of eliminating the changes during the lame duck session. You get what's going on here? This was the one we were talking about the other day. They've voted to approve the One Fair Wage ballot initiative for the next ballot, even though they disapprove of doing the things that the initiative would do if it passed. So, in other words, among them, raising the minimum wage, and I think it had something to do with sick time as well, although maybe that's in the next section here. So, the idea, though, is that they will change at least the wording of the ballot initiative while they're still in lame duck session. Currently, the House is considering a vote on legislation proposed by the Senate that would not implement this $12 an hour wage until the year 2030. It would cap the minimum wage at $4 an hour for tipped workers, also in 2030, require that tips be collected by the employer, not the employee, and eliminate the current indexing to inflation of the minimum wage. With respect to paid sick time, similar to the One Fair Wage issue, the Republican-controlled legislature voted to approve the Time to Care ballot initiative, which created paid leave time for all Michigan workers. Under the ballot proposal, now law. I see. Does that mean that one was on the ballot, and was the One Fair Wage initiative on the ballot also, and did they both win? I am just not familiar with what was on the ballot in terms of proposals, initiatives in Michigan. But at least the paid sick leave one, it says here, passed on the ballot So if nothing gets done, it stands as law. So let's see. Under the ballot proposal, now law, all workers, regardless of the size of the business that they are employed at, would be eligible to earn 1 hour of paid time off for every 30 hours worked. Currently, the House is considering a vote on legislation proposed by the Senate that would change this to 1 hour for every 40 hours worked, cap the potential to earn sick time at 1 hour per week, regardless of the total hours worked, and not apply any paid sick time requirements to any businesses with 50 or fewer employees who reside within 75 miles of the business. This final change essentially eliminates the requirement as it applies to 40% of Michigan workers. Statewide ballot proposals and weakening of state officials is the next section here. The 3 statewide ballot proposals that were passed in Michigan, this clears it up for me, by Michigan voters are under attack by the Republicans. These proposals include the legalization of recreational marijuana, the creation of a nonpartisan redistricting commission, and a voters' Bill of Rights. There's more information available about each of those things with a click here. But further, in an effort to limit the authority of our incoming governor, attorney general, and secretary of state, Michigan Republicans have introduced bills that would allow the legislature to intervene and interfere in work that is outside of their scope. This is a blatant attempt to grab power because the election did not go their way. Proposal 1 on marijuana, the Senate Majority Leader has proposed legislation that would eliminate the portion of the law that allows for any self-growing of marijuana. Proposal 2, Voters Not Politicians was the name of that proposal. Senator David Robertson has proposed legislation that would remove the regulation of campaign finance laws and oversight over the Independent Redistricting Commission from the Secretary of State and place that in the hands of a politically appointed board. And with respect to Proposal 3, the Voters' Bill of Rights, there are 5 bills. Senate Bills 1237 through 1242. I guess the sponsor here is by the name of Kowal, Kowall. Those Senate bills have been introduced and would alter provisions of Proposal 3. And it says here that they're currently unsure of what these changes are, but will provide information soon. Wow. Interesting. So also changes with respect to public employees. Let's see. The line 5, which I guess is familiar to those of you in Michigan, but not to me. Their bill here, the Senate bill, would put the Mackinac Bridge Authority in control of a tunnel beneath the Straits of Mackinac that would eventually replace Enbridge Line 5. It would also interfere with Governor-elect Whitmer and Attorney General-elect Nessel in shutting down the environmentally hazardous pipeline and also transfer liability from Enbridge to taxpayers in the event of a spill. What fun. Wow. Well, there's a lot going on here, but we still haven't gotten to the puppies, but we got to include that. There's information or legislation on puppy mills, and that's really the only way that puppies could enter into this, I think. House Bills 5916 and 5917. These bills would dramatically change how pet stores operate and are able to acquire puppies. These changes would make it harder for local governments to regulate pet stores, potentially putting animals at risk. These bills have passed the House and are now headed to the Senate. So I think that's a pretty good update on what's going on. There's, of course, also action on wetlands, and as I mentioned, public employees. But so far, I think we've probably already given you enough information to motivate you to act. So by all means, refer to their post or to the post from LOL GOP on what to do. When we last left off, we were saying check out all the damage that they were doing, the Republicans. And then number 2 on LOL GOP's list, raise your voice. Make sure you call your state House and state Senate reps, if only to thank them for opposing all these unnecessary attacks on the state, if that's what they're doing. But the Detroit Free Press's Brian Dickerson noted that this is ultimately a gut check for Rick Snyder, whose greatest accomplishment as governor, Medicaid expansion, came while he was willing to defy his party. So see if you can perhaps lean on him there to stand up just one more time to his party before they wreak their lame duck havoc. Okay, so I think that gets us up to date on the current anti-democratic crises in those two states. And that leaves us with one more segment, either to turn once again to the story of the Saud family feud behind the Jamal Khashoggi murder, or something else as yet unidentified and unaddressed in today's program that I feel is so super important that it must displace this thing. And maybe we'll just give up on it because if I scan it again and it looks like we won't be able to fit it in this segment, then I'll really have ruined the story. We'll check it out after these 2-minute breaks. Hi, it's me, David Waldman, your host for Kagro in the Morning, interrupting this little break to say thanks so much to all of you who are contributing supporters of Kagro in the Morning. Thousands of you are downloading the show each day, but fewer than 1 in 25 regular listeners are donating to help keep us on the air. For the money you'd spend on a single 3-minute iTunes song, we bring you 2 hours of great news and entertainment every day, 5 days a week. Patreon.com, Patreon.com makes it easy. You can find us there by searching Kagro X or David Waldman or Kagro in the Morning or even Daily Coast Radio in their search box, and you'll be right where you need to be to make easy, recurring monthly contributions to support our show. Once again, thanks so much for your support. Welcome back now to the Kagro in the Morning Show here on Netroots Radio. Nearly missed the re-intro there as I'm scanning through yesterday's, or the article we began on yesterday, and I guess we might as well continue on it. Even though there are many other things that I need to throw at you, we still have a couple more days this week. Let's give this a shot at digging a little further into the Saud family drama that led to this, because I still am unclear why they did what they did. And this may not clear it up any better. I mean, it may just be that they're all nuts and there's nothing we can do about it. But, well, there are some things we might do differently going forward if we have a better understanding of what's going on here. We left off, I think, after discussing the beginnings of the succession struggle that take place when then King Abdullah is dying in the hospital, and competing factions, I guess, of the family are showing up expecting to either to take power or expecting to, manipulate things before power is handed over, which, maybe makes a better transition from the last couple of stories than I thought. It's a little bit like the lame duck session of the King Abdullah court here, as Abdullah loyalists move in knowing that power will transfer to King Salman, or the next king, Salman, Abdullah's younger brother, and that after Salman, who is pretty elderly himself, power may be up in the air, and it's highly questionable and highly lucrative, I'm sure, in Saudi Arabia, where the power lands. And so people who are lining up behind Salman, I guess, in that analog to Wisconsin and Michigan are I'm not saying that they're morally the same. I'm just saying they're in the position of Democrats in Wisconsin and Michigan, the incoming power, and under the rules entitled to inherit and then wield the power. But there's this transitional period where the lame duck Republicans on behalf of King Abdullah are still manipulating things. But, again, without any moral equivalence. And I guess if you try to inject some moralism into all of this, the King Abdullah factions, well, it's questionable. Are they manipulating power as lame ducks in order to enrich themselves and get a hold of money that's stashed away or power that's stashed away somewhere? Or do they see in the incoming regime of King Salman the reality that he's coming to the throne already quite elderly, that he's not likely to last long himself, and that power after his passing will really be up in the air and that there are perhaps some rather unsavory characters who would have a claim to the throne and the power that goes with it if nothing is done beforehand. And it may be in the closing moments of the Abdullah regime, they can lay the groundwork for a succession that is either more to their liking, or if you think that they have it in them, more to the liking of the rest of the world. But I don't know if we really want to imbue them with that kind of dignity or not. But maybe. I'm not saying they're incapable of it. I'm just saying it's hard to believe about royals anywhere, I think. Okay, so they have some struggles over who controls what as Abdullah dies, and including the power that goes along with the information that Abdullah is actually already dead, and that Salman at that point would be wielding the power, at least nominally, though everyone was aware that very likely his son, Mohammed bin Salman, would be manipulating the power from behind the throne. So let's see. One name that came up here was an avid courtier who helped King Salman and his son, Mohammed bin Salman, consolidate power in the early months, was Saud al-Qahtani. That's, here, who knows how they spell it and transliterate it from Arabic elsewhere, but Qahtani, al-Qahtani. Saud al-Qahtani, a lawyer and former Air Force member with a penchant for hacking and social media. Remember this? The Salman camp had initially been suspicious of Qahtani because he had worked as one of Tuwaidri's assistants, and you might have to refer back to figure out which guy that was. But one of his assistants at the royal court since the early 2000s, Qahtani was interrogated and beaten in the first days after Salman's accession, says one palace insider, but he soon proved his loyalty to MBS with a vengeance. As director of the court's Center for Studies and Media Affairs, Qahtani fed MBS's suspicion about potential rivals and coup plotters. Qahtani also began assembling cyber weapons to use on behalf of MBS. In June of 2015, he contacted a shadowy Italian group, remember, known as the Hacking Team, and we were wondering why that was not a better name. Okay, well, long story-ish, short, I guess, down here at the bottom, Saudi and U.S. investigators have concluded that Qahtani, as MBS's commander of information-related operations, helped organize Khashoggi's murder. Now on to the section called Family Politics here. King Salman's team began playing hard-nosed family politics from its very first week in power. I guess you can see why the Abdullah faction wanted to delay the news. In late January 2015, a royal decree removed two of Abdullah's sons, we read about this, Turki and Mishal, as governors of Riyadh and Mecca, respectively. Their ouster left scars that never healed. MBS, just 29 then, was installed as Minister of Defense. Mohammed bin Nayef, the pliable son of the powerful former Interior Minister and a favorite of the CIA, was named Deputy Crown Prince below Crown Prince Mukrin, an unassuming former head of intelligence. So already the Crown Prince situation not working out to MBS's advantage at that point, so I guess he's got to start moving. Salman and MBS tightened their control further in April of 2015. Mukrin was dumped as crown prince and replaced by Mohammed bin Nayef. A year later, as a farewell gift, the king gave Mukrin the 280-foot luxury yacht Solange, in addition to other perks, according to a Saudi who was familiar with the transactions. So you're not crown prince, but you get a big boat. MBS became deputy crown prince, formally joining the line of succession. He wasn't even in it, I guess, officially, until they began making these moves. Though not yet 30, MBS was already a Machiavellian prince encouraged by Mohammed bin Zayed, the crown prince of Abu Dhabi, and Sheikh Tanoun, a senior UAE intelligence official who visited MBS's yacht frequently on weekends during that first year. MBS already had a reputation in Riyadh as a hothead, who in his younger days had intimidated a land registry official who was blocking a property transfer the young prince wanted by sending him a bullet as a warning. I do believe we read this. MBS proclaimed his desire to modernize the kingdom, but he was also paranoid about rivals such as Abdullah's sons, as well as Mohammed bin Nayef, who was in front of him in the line of succession, and later about the threat from the uncontrollable journalist Khashoggi. And one can finally, hopefully, find out what was so uncontrollable about him and why did they care. 2 warning signs in September of 2015 should have alerted observers that MBS was a Saudi prince who could jumpstart the kingdom or drive it off a cliff, as a headline on a 2016 piece of mine put it. And I guess, again, here we need to remind ourselves of whose piece we're actually reading. It's David Ignatius. And I believe we actually discussed this part yesterday, too. So it's hard to even remember how far we got on this thing. Okay. Ambassador Joseph Westphal, American envoy in Riyadh, traveled that month to Jeddah, planning to see Mohammed bin Nayef, but he was rerouted at the airport and sent to see MBS instead, an unsubtle suggestion of who was really boss. That same month, a longtime Saudi intelligence official named Saad al-Jabri visited then CIA Director John Brennan in Washington during a private visit. Jabri, a close advisor to Mohammed bin Nayef, hadn't told Salman about the trip. When Jabri returned home, he was fired. He now lives in exile. Members of the Abdullah clan were watching as MBS grasped the levers of power that had once been theirs. Knowing that Brennan and other members of the Obama administration were uneasy about MBS, several of Abdullah's sons hired a leading strategic advisory firm in Washington to gather information about the new dynamic in U.S.-Saudi relations. The meetings were hardly a secret plot, as MBS may have imagined. Over several days in May of 2016, Prince Turki bin Abdullah and his closest advisor, Saudi businessman Obaid, who I guess had been named earlier in the piece, met with a series of former CIA and State Department officials in a suite at the Four Seasons Hotel in Georgetown. They were accompanied by Major General Ali al-Qahtani, the military advisor and protector of Turki and other sons of the late King Abdullah, and the man who would end up dead the next year after being held at the Riyadh Ritz-Carlton. I, again, David Ignatius, met the group at the hotel, too, to gather information for the profile I was writing about MBS. I remembered that Turki was careful in his comments. He expressed concern about the need for more balance in Saudi policy, but he didn't propose any changes in governance. Obaid, in an interview, described Turki's May 2016 Washington contacts this way. The round of meetings was to get a strategic assessment on U.S. perspectives on the kingdom and its standing through knowledgeable U.S. defense and national security officials. Unquote. MBS came to Washington the next month. Basically, they're both probing the foreign policy establishment of the United States to see which one of them might have American support if they moved to kill the other, more than likely. And one faction probably thought it would have President Obama's backing, but there wasn't a whole lot of time to move under Obama's protection. And the other side perhaps thought that they would do better under whichever new regime came to power after Obama. I don't know. We'll see. MBS came to Washington the next month, in June of 2016, to meet with President Barack Obama and other officials, and up until then the administration had been studiously neutral amid the mounting tension in the royal family, even with the crown prince and deputy seemingly on collision course. But Obama was impressed by the vision and energy that MBS brought to his reform agenda, and after that June visit, the United States tilted toward the young, hothead reformer. I mean, I could see how that could happen. As between the various crown princes of Saudi Arabia who could take power, who really cares? You know, one guy, but if one of them shows up and pays lip service to a reform agenda, well, then fine. Why not back that one? Because really, what's the difference? I mean, there may be a huge difference, and people living in Saudi Arabia can't believe that I would say such a thing, though they're not listening to me. But perhaps people who have more experience living there would say, you have to make an affirmative choice. It's not a matter of them all being the same. From a certain distance, though, you can see what I mean. How do you make choices as the United States in promotion of democracy as between royal monarchist dictators, right? Well, you go with the one who at least says he's interested in reform, I guess. The Abdullah clan retained some important foreign connections, especially in Asia. In 2016, those became increasingly tangled with MBS's agenda. Obaid traveled to Shanghai in July of 2016 to prepare for Turki bin Abdullah's participation in a meeting of the International Finance Forum, which would be held there that September, a few days before the Group of 20 meeting that would take place in Hangzhou. Hangzhou, let's say. Perhaps add a little spice to that one. Rather than Hangzhou. Maybe that's right. Since MBS would be attending the G20, Turkey's plan to attend the IFF meeting carried a hint of intra-Saudi rivalry. Obaid checked into a suite at the Peninsula Hotel on the Bund. In the adjoining room was Major General Ali al-Qahtani. Then things began to get weird. This chain of events was described by several Saudi, Swiss, and American sources. Obaid was Turkey's emissary on an important business venture. Turkey had agreed to invest at least $10 million in a development fund called the Silk Road Finance Corporation, or SRFC, headed by an MIT-educated chief executive named Shan Li, according to the organization's website. The Chinese eminence behind the Silk Road Initiative was Chen Yuan, a very senior leader who had headed the China Development Bank from 1998 to 2013, and whose father was reportedly one of the founders of the Chinese Communist Party. When Obaid traveled to Beijing in early August 2016 to negotiate the terms of Turkey's investment, he had a perhaps significant encounter at the sumptuous Park Hyatt Hotel. He had been invited by John Thornton, the chairman of Silk Road Finance, to meet for dinner with him and Lee. Thornton also invited Michael Klein, a New York investment banker who at the time was rumored to be a key advisor to MBS on his plan to raise as much as $100 billion through an initial public offering of some shares of Saudi Aramco, providing a welcome cash boost for a country facing a budget squeeze because of low oil prices. Klein, it says parenthetically, didn't end up representing the kingdom on this deal. The job went to other bankers. Klein met with Obaid only briefly and then left, according to his spokeswoman and Thornton. During the Park Hyatt meeting with the Silk Road Group, Obaid warned that the Saudi Aramco IPO, by imposing Western disclosure standards, could have a drastic effect on Saudi national security by weakening the royal family's grip on power, since Aramco had long been one of the main pillars for ruling the kingdom. Instead, said Obaid, the Chinese should raise cash by working with the Saudis on a barter deal to trade some of China's vast stockpile of U.S. Treasury bonds in exchange for Saudi oil. This is getting complicated. By criticizing MBS's privatization plan in front of the Chinese investment group, Obaid was, in effect, urging the Chinese to support the traditional Saudi system that under Abdullah and previous kings had maintained stability and security. Klein said through a spokeswoman that during this his brief conversation with Obaid, he never discussed either an oil barter deal or the privatization of Saudi Aramco. Thornton remembers Obaid making the oil barter proposal, but doesn't recall who was present. I didn't give it a second thought as a serious idea, he said in a phone interview. According to a Silk Road executive who requested anonymity, Turkey and Obaid never became actual investors in the venture. Word of the criticism of MBS's privatization plan by the Abdullah clan's chief financial advisor may have gotten back to Riyadh. A week or so later, Obaid began receiving a barrage of calls from Saudi numbers he didn't recognize and didn't answer. Eventually, according to a knowledgeable source, he received a call from Khalid Humaydan, head of the General Intelligence Presidency, as the Saudi intelligence service is known. Humaydan said the royal court wanted Obaid to return to Saudi Arabia immediately, the knowledgeable source said. Obaid responded that he needed to check first with his boss, Prince Turki. According to the knowledgeable source, Turki called Humaydan and asked whether King Salman had personally ordered Obaid's return. If it's the king who has requested this, I will personally fly Tarek back home now, Turki is said to have told the intelligence chief. The request was instead described as from the court, and Turki is said to have advised Obaid to remain in China. On August 21st, Li invited Obaid to come to Beijing to look at an office for the Silk Road Finance Corp that would be located in Yintai Center in the heart of downtown, a source said. It was a fashionable spot with the new Park Hyatt Hotel in the building. Li said that Obaid could meet Chen, the godfather of the Silk Road venture, on the trip. I'm beginning to believe we should read up on this Silk Road group. On the afternoon of August 25th, Obaid flew from Shanghai to Beijing on a private jet. When the plane landed, it taxied to a remote area of the airport. Parked nearby was a plane with the tail marking HZATR. The HZ prefix designated it as a Saudi plane. What happened next was described by knowledgeable Saudi and Swiss sources who were briefed on the case. As Obaid left his plane, he was stopped by more than 40 plainclothes Chinese security men. The leader of the group, speaking in Arabic, is said to have told Obaid, "We are the Ministry of State Security. Are you going to cooperate?" Obaid surrendered. His head and body were covered in a bag so tight that he couldn't see or move unassisted. He was taken to an interrogation facility somewhere in Beijing and handcuffed to a chair. A Chinese intelligence officer asserted that Obaid was a terrorist financier who was organizing a plot by Pakistani militants to disrupt the G20 summit scheduled for the next month, a source briefed on the case said. "Where are you hiding the terrorists? Where are you hiding the Pakistani militiamen?" demanded the interrogator. Obaid protested that he had no idea what they were talking about. They had the wrong man. He was subjected to a lengthy and painful interrogation ordeal. Fortunately, Ministry of State Security technicians were examining Obaid's iPad and cell phone and checking the information against their own sources. Quickly, the Chinese concluded that an error had indeed been made. Saudi officials had given them false information about Obaid to arrest him as a terrorist and extradite him back to the kingdom. Wow. Just consider that alongside the Interpol stories we were reading the last couple of weeks, too. It's a scary thing out there. According to a knowledgeable source, a senior Ministry of State Security officer told Obaid, "Look, there's been a mistake. Someone in your country called us 5 minutes before you landed in Beijing and said you were a terrorist financing a hit on the G20 summit." The Chinese official explained, "You are stuck in a power play in your country between two powerful princes." Chinese intelligence officers, angry that they had been deceived, arranged for Obaid to quickly travel back to Shanghai and protected him for the rest of his stay in China. Meanwhile, the Saudis, who had hoped to snatch Obaid in Beijing, were furious that he had slipped their grasp. They sent agents to search hotels in Beijing looking for the Abdullah clan's operative. In Shanghai, Obaid received a call from General Yusuf bin Ali al-Idrisi, deputy head of Saudi intelligence, telling him to fly back to Beijing and get on the Saudi plane that had been sent to pick him up, according to a source briefed on the case. Obaid turned again for advice to his patron, Prince Turki, who called Idrisi. According to a knowledgeable source, Turkey said, if the king wants it, it will be done. On whose behalf are you speaking? Idrissi gave an ambiguous answer about who had ordered Obaid's forced departure from China. Obaid stayed in Shanghai under close guard of the Ministry of State Security for another week. Because Obaid had a Swiss passport, another strange turn of events here, he also received protection from the Swiss consulate in Shanghai. A January 11, 2017 letter to Obaid's lawyer from Swiss Consul General Francois Kilias Zillweger, confirms, referring to the assumption of responsibility for Mr. Tarek Obaid, I inform you that this consulate general has provided benefits under the consular protection. Okay, that's probably been translated about 5 times. Turkey arrived in China on August 30th and spoke at the IFF meeting on September 1st. He was also photographed with President Xi Jinping. MBS arrived for the G20 summit that took place in Hangzhou, September 4th and 5th. By then, Obaid was on Turkey's private Airbus flying to Switzerland. Yeah, that's where I'd go too. The Chinese checked to make sure that Obaid had arrived safely in Geneva. Once there, Obaid was immediately treated at a specialized clinic for injuries he had suffered in China, according to a Swiss source. Wow, it's getting crazy. MBS spoke at the G20 gathering about his Vision 2030 modernization plan, but privately he was said to be upset when he learned about Idrissi's embarrassing failure in the rendition effort. When he returned home, MBS conducted an investigation, that's enclosed in scare quotes, of the incident. Idrissi was fired as deputy chief of intelligence, replaced later by General Ahmed al-Asiri, the man the Saudis would later dismiss on suspicion that he helped plot Khashoggi's killing in Istanbul. Boy, they're going through security guys like I don't know what. The Saudis sent a special delegation to China to apologize for the misuse of intelligence channels in the Obaid case. A Saudi official close to MBS explained the kingdom's chagrin in a private statement to a fellow Saudi. They were embarrassed by al-Idrissi's mistake. I mean, Saudi Arabia was even embarrassed by this behavior. He, Idrissi, made a mistake. He shouldn't have done this. Says Obaid of the false accusation that he was a terrorist. There was clear abuse of power by incompetent thugs, but I don't believe that the Crown Prince's instructions were for these events to play out as they did. Oh, why not? But MBS's royal court evidently didn't learn the lesson. The suspicion of perceived enemies and desire for absolute control only deepened. Starting in the spring of 2017, the Saudis began a secret program for kidnapping dissidents and holding them at secret sites. According to knowledgeable U.S. and Saudi experts, the program involved a special Tiger team, in quotes again, operating in tandem with the Center for Studies and Media Affairs at the Royal Court, headed by Katani. Look out for those studies of media affairs. Wow. Turki al-Sheikh, another Turkey. Another close MBS advisor helped oversee the interrogation sites, according to the U.S. and Saudi experts. MBS's internal putsch gathered momentum last year as the Crown Prince began to fear that his life was threatened, probably with good reason. In June 2017, Mohammed bin Nayef was humiliatingly deposed as Crown Prince and replaced by MBS. In November, a week after Kushner's visit, MBS rounded up his royal enemies, starting with Turki bin Abdullah, and warehoused them at the Ritz-Carlton. The detainees included some of the most senior princes and wealthiest commoners in the kingdom. After the Ritz-Carlton resumed its hotel business, new detainees were taken to secret sites. Several Saudi women's rights activists were detained in May of 2018, just a month before MBS removed the ban on women driving. MBS critics say that the Crown Prince didn't want the female activists to get the credit for his reform. One of the activists was so traumatized by her harsh treatment that she tried to commit suicide, according to a human rights activist, reportedly by slitting her wrists with a razor blade. Obaid remains in Switzerland. He's under investigation there and in the United States on suspicion of improper payments from the Malaysian sovereign wealth fund known as 1MDB to a company called Petro Saudi International, which was founded by Turki bin Abdullah and Obaid. He has not been accused of any wrongdoing. Obaid now trying to finance his own group, eh? Wow. It's really getting crazy there, and there's still more to go, but not that much more, but too much for us to get through once again today. But a last section that happens to be entitled Brutal Paranoia. Perhaps we'll get to that, perhaps we'll discuss it, perhaps we'll just round it up tomorrow, but it really got pretty crazy out there. Well, yeah, I guess he's not wrong, Donald Trump, when he says it's a dangerous world out there, but man, oh man. Unbelievable. Okay, but we're finally closing into, I guess, an explanation of why they wanted to kill Khashoggi. It turns out the explanation is just, well, he's out there and he's a dissident. I don't know. I mean, MBS seemed to be doing really well with his PR push around the world to look like a reform-minded futurist for once as king of Saudi Arabia, or potentially king of Saudi Arabia. Why the murder spree? I don't know. I get the feeling that we might only be hearing half the story. And maybe one day we'll hear, I don't know whether it'll be true or not, but a counter effort on MBS's behalf to cast the other guys as the brutal murderers.
From Daily Kos Radio on networksradio.com. You have been listening to the Kagro in the Morning Show
with David Waldman.
Well, all kinds of great stuff, of course, and largely different from what we've been complaining about here today. Next up on the West Coast Cookbook and Speakeasy with Justice Putnam, touching on all kinds of fantastic stories that I really would love to have gotten to, but thank God they're backing us up here on Netroots Radio next.